Oh, okay, so we're live now. Good. Something happened, I don't know. Maybe it was the hashtag I had, sex work. That's what we were about to talk about. And I don't know.
Still about to talk about
We're going to talk about it again.
Yeah.
We only got like 3 minutes into it, and then Facebook decided or something to happen, and we got cut off. That's the first time that's happened to us. Anyway, so we're going to talk about sex work right now. So if anybody is easily offended, you probably might want to tune out. And this is Dee Dee River. My name's Trish Roberts. And Dee Dee River is... she has a master's in sexual health, but she's also been a project officer at the Sex Worker Outreach Project in Canberra. So Dee Dee has some unique insights, and so we're going to do a bit of discussion. So as I said, if you're easily offended by the topic, by sex work and sex in general, then this is probably not the live stream for you. So adieu. Anyway, so Dee Dee, I'm going to, was there anything else I wanted to add to that? No. Okay, so...
you were going to say that the real news...
Can everybody hear okay? Hi, Gillian. Hi, Marilyn.
That there was a Real News Network show.
There was a Real News Network show.
About a month ago.
Yeah.
And it was somebody from SWAP in the United States.
Yeah, Sex Worker Outreach Project in the United States. So the Real News Network interviewed her, and it was a very good interview, actually. It's surprising. Not sensationalized at all. Oftentimes, you get these terrible...
really sensationally.
Yeah, it's terrible, really. So that was good. So I will leave a link to that particular interview, and I hope, people will check it out. So anyway, Dee Dee, I was going to ask a few questions here, and so Dee Dee, what's the difference between sex work and prostitution?
Okay. Basically, there's kind of two answers. One is that prostitution is generally seen in a very pejorative light. It gets used, lawyers are prostitutes, politicians are prostitutes, and so on, and it's seen very negatively for anybody who's selling out. Sex work, of course, is a less pejorative term, but there's also a more technical issue, which is that prostitution generally covers, direct sexual services, intercourse, and that sort of thing, and sex work is seen as the whole gamut of sexual employment. Things like exotic dancers and people who are doing porn modeling and that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of things that are covered by sex work.
So that's under the umbrella of sex work, that definition. Yeah. I see.
It's more than just direct services.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so when trafficking refers to forced sex work, does this sound like the experience of most of the sex workers that you've encountered in your job?
No. Basically, there's been a bit of a beat-up about trafficking. It does occur some places in the world, but I think there would be very few people who might go to a sex worker who would be happy with any notion that that person was not consenting, was in some way trapped in that situation. And so...
That's an interesting thing, isn't it? That oftentimes you often hear, the mainstream media rarely uses the term sex work. Yeah. But if they're referring to sex work, if they call it prostitution, they always sort of make out as if every single person engaged in sex work is being trafficked and that they're sex slaves, etc.
Yeah.
Would that be?
I think real sex slavery is actually quite rare. I think it does happen in some places
It happens in Romania and places like it's becoming more widespread.
Well,
but
I think in Romania even the majority of sex work is consensual sex work. I think one of the issues with so-called trafficking is people who cross borders to do sex work, and you find that often that's economically driven. Basically, they can't make much money where they are, and if they go to a different country and do sex work, then they'll make more money. And so people do that. One of the things working with SWAP in Canberra is the capital of Australia. It's in the Australian Capital Territory, or ACT, which is equivalent to the U.S. District of Columbia, or D.C. And it has, one of the things that I did as the project officer for SWAP was actually go around to various brothels. I think it was every fortnight that we went through, and we went to all of the Asian brothels and that sort of thing. And quite often the Asian brothels, where most of the workers are Asian, a number of the workers came from Southeast Asia. And very often those people were fairly educated. They were often people with university degrees, and they had come over basically to make money. And frequently they went from one brothel to another. They had made some sort of an agreement with people who ran those things to go spend maybe a month in one place and a month maybe in Sydney, a month in Canberra, a month in Melbourne, and that maximized their income. And the thing is that legally all of those people would have been seen as trafficked, and they're often represented as sex slaves. And you have situations where politically, if they're arrested, they're told that if they say that they are being coerced, they will be released, and otherwise they will be imprisoned, and that sort of thing. And so you get kind of quite a big distortion. And this notion of sexual slavery or sexual traffic is a bit of a beat up. Talking to the Australian Federal Police, there were almost no cases. When I was working there, I called them up, and they had been posting ads in the singles adult areas of advertising in newspapers, saying that if you know of somebody who is being coerced or sex slaves or any of this sort of stuff, call in this line, and did kind of a big, this is happening. And it had been going on for a couple of years, this program, and I talked to the federal police and said, has anyone ever called up on this?
Has anybody ever called
up on this, saying that anybody was in trouble or had been trafficked or
sex trafficked and stuff?
And the police had to say no.
Right.
That really didn't happen.
Right.
And I mean, it's interesting going around to those places.
To brothels.
To the brothels.
Yes.
The Asian brothels and so on. Those people had been coming over in order to work. We did visit those places on a regular basis. We made sure that people were being treated well. This is one of the things SWAP does, is to try and, in a sense, it's like a union for sex workers, and it tries to make sure that the conditions and that sort of stuff aren't exploitative or aren't any and the situations are consensual.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that happens...
It's kind of essential, really, that SWAP, Sex Workers Outreach Project, in some ways aren't government funded in a way, isn't it? Because I think you can probably get more done and more control. Would you say that? Do you think it's better to have?
Well, it's definitely better to have it be independent.
Yeah, but that's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I think a lot of sex worker organizations like that are independent.
Oh, okay.
I think SWAP in the United States is independent.
That's here.
You have groups like Scarlet Alliance in the United States,
Yeah.
I mean in Australia,
Yeah.
where it is an umbrella organization for various things like SWAP. I mean, there's a SWAP in the ACT, there's a SWAP in New South Wales.
Yeah.
There's organizations with different names in other states.
Yeah.
But Scarlet Alliance is kind of an umbrella organization for that kind of thing.
Yes.
And, I mean, the last thing these organizations want is to see sex workers exploited. They're basically working to end those kind of exploited situations.
And there's often people who say, well, the whole idea of sex work is exploitative to women. You know, what would you say to that?
Okay. I think in capitalism, virtually any kind of work is exploitative. I think many people take jobs that not all aspects of them are fabulous. Certainly in the hospitality industry, there's an awful lot of that kind of stuff. People working as barmaids or waitresses, particularly the kind of places where people are expected to wear short skirts and
and Hooters and places like that.
And very often those places, are the workers are very poorly paid. The conditions are not very good. And quite often people who are employing them can be sexually exploitative.
Exploited, yeah.
And,
capitalism
and
in
quite
itself.
Often, capitalism in itself
is
basically
problematic.
Is problematic.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think for sex workers, it is, in general, the decision that people make to, in terms of the income they're liable to make, the hours that they will have to work, and they are conditions that those people will accept.
Yeah.
And they feel that will be their best option in work terms.
Yeah, I mean, in Iraq, after the invasion of Iraq, a lot of Iraqi women, unfortunately, had to turn to sex work to survive.
Yeah.
So, passing judgments about why people do what they do is not helpful because people do all sorts of things that they are kind of forced into do. I mean, if we had a healthy society and a society that wasn't, sort of where the 1% is getting everything and everybody else is getting squeezed out of existence, the people would probably have different, maybe they might make different choices, but then there are people who really enjoy sex work as well. So there's all that, isn't there, really?
I think one of the things with, like you bring up Iraq.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a situation which is really dire for
dire.
a lot of women.
Absolutely.
I think there's situations like Romania was after Ceausescu left, where the economy collapsed.
Yeah.
And sex work, and let me just say that sex work isn't only women.
Yes, that's right.
Sex work includes trans people, men, or and so on.
Yeah.
And
we're talking as white people too, so please excuse us. I mean, we can only really talk from
But I mean, my experience within SWAP was with people of a diverse cultural diversity.
Sure.
And again, I'd say that looking at it in a intersectional sense, a lot of people of color or whatever are subject to racism and various other issues, which means that they have fewer economic choices, and so they may be overrepresented within sex work. And they also may be targeted more by police and other authorities because they're seen as more vulnerable.
Yeah.
But, I mean, sex workers in general are seen as vulnerable.
Yeah, and we'll get to talking how that can be sort of addressed.
But I wanted to go back to that issue of, using Iran. Well, I think when we're talking about sex work in some place like the United States or Australia, I think using an example like Iran is,
Iraq.
Iraq or any other war zone is problematic. Because I think a situation in a war zone is very different.
Sure. I'm just pointing out that I was just pointing out that they're forced into situations themselves because of an invasion where it's created incredible inequality.
I think in those cases, it's often, there are very, very few options.
Sure.
And in some place like Australia, or the United States, for some people there may not be so many options, but there's certainly a lot more options.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more freedom, and so you find in many ways it's more consensual, but it is a decision people make.
Yeah.
And of course people can be in dire situations where they feel it is one of the few options they have, but but in many cases, it's an option people take because they feel it is the best option.
Sure.
I mean, you often find people who do have other options to work, stacking shelves at Walmart or working as a waitress for $1.30 an hour or something, or for tips.
Yes.
And they just find it's actually less exploitative and a better situation for them to be doing that.
Yes.
But that's a problem with capitalism. That's not a problem with sex work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so if we talk about, you'll have to, excuse me, I might say some naff things, and Dee Dee will have to correct me. This is a subject that I don't know very much about, and except from what I've watched and on Real News Network and from what Dee Dee tells me, but still I'm a bit of a slow learner sometimes. What have we got here?
Forrest Caesar is really hurting legitimate animal.
Anyway. So we'll get down to the next question I was going to ask. A lot of people talk about the Swedish model, where the law really heavily penalizes customers, those who want to buy sex, instead of sex workers. How would that actually affect sex workers?
Okay. Basically, this is something that's been pushed. They're saying, rather than decriminalize sex work, or criminalize sex workers, you should criminalize the clients of sex workers, the so-called Johns, and that would be the way to do it. This is something that really doesn't work because it doesn't change the situation for those people who are doing sex work. For whatever reason, they still see sex work as their best option. And what it does is basically drives it back underground, because if you have the clients criminalized, then you can't openly be a sex worker. Because that opens your clients up to arrest or whatever. And if that happens, well, you're not going to have any clients. So basically,
it's penalizing.
It all moves back into the shadows. People try and keep it secret and hidden, and this opens up the whole thing. I mean, I'd like to go into that whole issue of criminalization and the reason for decriminalization.
Yeah.
And the reason for decriminalization is basically so that sex workers can come out of those legal shadows and have recourse to the law. Basically, when sex work is illegal, it means that sex workers become vulnerable. It means that predators will see them as people who they can attack, and those people can't go to the police because the police will arrest the sex workers. It means that if that person disappears, people won't speak about it because they're sex workers. And so you get situations
like
where
serial
killers often target sex workers because they're seen as a vulnerable population who can disappear. It also stigmatizes sex work, so people don't tell people, and so they're living a secretive life. People don't know where they are frequently. They may be living a more transitory life, and so on. Where if sex work is decriminalized, then people will be able to live more openly and just say, yes, I'm a sex worker. Their parents may know, their friends may know. If something happens to them, if they go missing, people will know about it. Also, you can, if you get attacked, if you are beaten or robbed, or raped, then you can go to the police and say, this has happened, because sex workers get raped. Rape is, sex workers are just as vulnerable to rape, or more so, because they are vulnerable, because they are seen as illegal, and you can do things to them and they won't say anything.
Yes.
They're also, people talk about pimps. Well, pimps generally come from two things. One is if sex workers are being picked up by the police in some ways, you have somebody who is procuring somebody. They are a man who frequently goes and says to somebody, are you looking for a sex worker? And they can't be arrested for that because they are not the sex worker, and they can take that person to that person. And then there's also the thing of people offering, in a sense, protection, because there are people who rob sex workers, who assault sex workers, and that sort of thing. And the thing is, in a situation or in a country or jurisdiction where sex work is decriminalized, then you don't have the need for that, because a sex worker could go to the police. You don't need to have somebody doing that. I mean, you might have someone who they might have for security, but it eliminates that sort of standover situation. It eliminates the situation where a sex worker needs somebody like that. It eliminates the situation where the police are frequently corrupt in relation to sex workers and, take bribes and demand sex and that sort of thing. And all of that happens as a result of criminalization. And all of that can be ended through decriminalization.
Yeah. So it has, would legalization help sex workers ensure there are standards for work and protection?
Well, okay. Sex workers prefer to talk about decriminalization rather than legalization.
Right.
Where, sex work is decriminalized, like in New South Wales, you have a situation where sex worker organizations demand certain standards. They say that this is work, and so there's occupational health and safety standards. Yeah. For instance, that if you are working in a parlor, a place, or a brothel, that you have, you know, a safety button that you can hit, that, you know, you have certain standards in terms of, you know, the provision of safe sex products, of showers, of, you know, clean sheets and all those sorts of things. Now, that's very standard in Australia, those sorts of things. And, you know, that it is clear that the sex worker is at choice. You know, they can say no. They can stop the session anytime they want, and so on. And that it is an economic agreement, you know, that a service is being sold. You know, this idea that you're buying the sex worker.
Yeah.
You know, no, that's not the case. You're buying a service.
That's
from the
somebody.
sex
That's
worker,
somebody's little fantasy, isn't it?
Which is defined. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a fantasy.
People seem to have. There's this fantasy put out in mainstream media that, you know, you're buying the person literally, and that you can do anything you want to a sex worker. Well, that's absolutely incorrect. And, you know, I mean, it's a deal, a negotiation of what that person wants to do, the client, isn't it?
I mean, in most places in the world,
yes,
that would be the case.
Yes.
There are places in the world where that may not be the case,
sure,
where, you know, basically people are under a lot more pressure, but in those
sure.
cases, there's usually criminalization.
Well, that's the ideal kind of thing, isn't it, of a negotiation? That's
the ideal.
Yes.
That's what sex work should be.
Sure.
And in a place where it's decriminalized, that's what it is.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
You are making a transaction. The transaction is defined. It's for a set amount of money, you know, and so on.
Yeah. And another question is whether a sex worker is a woman, a man, a trans person. The clients always seem to be men. Why is that, Didi?
Basically because of patriarchy. You know, like, I don't think sex workers pretend that patriarchy doesn't exist. You know, patriarchy certainly exists. You know, a lot of sex workers would love to see female clients. Sometimes they do. It tends to be much more rare. And that's basically because women are culturally conditioned not to try and find sexual satisfaction as an exchange, not to say, I'd like
money.
sex, I'd like this kind of sex, yeah, and I want that.
But sex workers are always happy when women come along too.
Yeah, almost all sex workers are very happy to see women clients.
They'd even give them discounts.
And generally give them discounts there. and this is both male and female sex workers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So has anybody got any questions at all? Because Didi's she's been a project officer at Sex Workers Outreach Project in Canberra in Australia. So if you have any questions at all, and please be polite. But yeah, just put them in the comments section, and Didi will have a go at answering them. And so there are feminists, Didi, and some progressives.
Do you want to go through some of these other things first?
I thought we might have actually covered that particular one. Do you think so?
No. There's the issue when people talk about legalization, which you mentioned before. Legalization in sex work terms usually means that sex work is regulated. And what that generally means is it's put in law as a form of regulation, and licenses are sold to certain brothels, and there may be, for instance, in Queensland, a set number of brothels that are allowed. And so what happens is people with money, generally men, with money and influence, and this is where you get bribery and corruption and so on, are the people who get those licenses.
Right.
And so if they get those licenses, and there's very few of them, and those are the areas where sex workers can work legally only in their brothels, then there's much more chance of exploitation. There's a lot more pressure and power in the hands of a brothel owner over the sex worker. And so this is something the sex workers prefer not to have. In decriminalization, you basically take it right out of the criminal code altogether. And you say, okay, this is like any other business. There may be some occupational health and safety regulations and that sort of thing, but you could have a parlor that's run by sex workers, as a collective, maybe 5 or 6 sex workers, instead of a Queensland model where you have, some rich white guy generally who might have 30 women working for him in some big establishment.
Right.
And instead you might have 3 or 4 people working together in a small private house. And they do that, work together frequently to reduce advertising costs and to basically be protection for one another. It allows them to make sure that there's other people there. The problem with people working on their own is that they're working on their own. So in some senses, they're more vulnerable. You get some places like some areas of New South Wales where the city councils have created a situation where they say it's legal for somebody to work on their own, but only one person can work, and they can't have anybody else associated with that. So that person can't have somebody there, a friend or something, who can be security. They can't work with another sex worker so that there's always somebody else present. And in some jurisdictions, some councils, and this is a problem with that. The problem with decriminalization is really that often what happens is the state or the law sends it back as an issue for councils to deal with, local councils. And the local councils will often make it difficult for people to establish any kind of sex work venue, to do sex work. And if they do, they come up with regulations like you have to be working from home. Now, this is something most sex workers would rather not do. They'd rather rent a room or something like that and work from there. Because if you're working from home, it means that all of your clients know where you live.
Yes.
And as a basic safety thing, that's tough.
Yes. Yes.
It's really bad.
Yes. And unfortunately, a lot of sex workers do work from home, don't they?
Well, a lot of them must work from home because of council regulations.
Yes. That's really, really
this
dangerous.
Is something sex workers try to stop.
Yes.
They try to make sure that people can work from some other venue.
Yeah.
Preferably with at least one other person.
Yeah. Yes, there's safety calls and stuff, isn't there?
Yeah. It's just safety in numbers.
Yeah, safety in numbers.
Like you have somebody else who's present.
Yeah.
Because you can get a client who becomes hostile or violent, and they think they can get away with it.
Yeah.
And if there's somebody else there, they can say, you can't do this.
Yeah, and because, sex work isn't decriminalised, I mean, they have to have things like the ugly mugs list, don't they?
Even if it is decriminalised, there are
they still
people
have to have that because
who do that.
There are people that are just abusive.
Yeah, to be clear, the ugly mugs list is basically a communication within the sex worker community, often put out by sex workers, that say there is this person going around who is either violent or trying to rob people or something like that, and they will report it to the police. The advantage of decriminalisation is, for instance, in New South Wales, there's actually, within the police, a sex worker liaison officer. So sex workers can go to that person and say, as somebody they know is sympathetic, and say, look, there's this guy, he's going around and doing this, or there's these people who are, doing this. They're trying to, present themselves as clients. When they get to the door, they start being violent and demand money and this kind of thing. And they can identify those people, then the police can take that seriously and go after those people.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other advantages, going back to that trafficking thing, in New South Wales, one of the things about having the decriminalisation as that sex workers feel they have rights. And I can think of one situation where there was a group of Asian workers who had been brought over, under some sort of a contract arrangement. And they were told, you come here and you'll get, this percentage of, the money, and we will look after your, accommodation and food and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And they felt like they were being exploited, and they went to the police. And they felt like, okay, this is decriminalised. We can go to the police and say,
excellent.
These people.
Was this in Canberra?
This was in Sydney, actually.
Oh, in Sydney.
And they said, these people are not sticking to their contract. The police didn't actually know what to do with that, and they ended up going to SWAP.
Right.
And SWAP talked to the workers, and they talked then to the police and to other authorities, and something was done about that.
Yeah.
But
that's an excellent thing to have a sex worker liaison officer, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's excellent.
It's very.
Is that
very
right
good.
Throughout Australia?
No.
Oh,
It
just
is.
in
It's
New
in
South
New
Wales?
South Wales. I think the ACT may have one. We were trying to get that when I was working there.
Yeah.
I don't think Tasmania has one.
Right. Yes.
But it's something that should be there.
Yeah, really. Really.
And not all, like I indicated, in Queensland, as a jurisdiction, sex work is legalized. You have that system where there are so many licenses for brothels. And so it's much more open to corruption than New South Wales.
Right. I see. Does anybody have any questions? Because feel free to, Dee Dee, just in case you haven't been and you've just joined in, Dee Dee's has been a project officer for the Sex Worker Outreach Project in Canberra, Australia. And so if you have any questions, please feel free. And she's also done a Master's in Sexual Health. So anyway, Dee Dee, I'll ask you this question about feminists, the sex worker exclusive feminists, I guess that would be. Seems like a big contradiction, but anyway. There are feminists and some progressives who would say that prostitution is inherently damaging to women, that it's damaging psychologically and physically. How would you respond to that kind of critique? I guess did we already cover that?
Well, no, we kind of just,
okay.
we covered the Swedish model and
That's
stuff like
right,
that.
yeah.
But the issue, as I said, patriarchy exists. Capitalism exists. Should there be a situation where women find sex work to be their best economic option, their best option for their life? Well, it would be preferable not to, in many ways, because there's still stigmatization and stuff.
Yeah.
It would be wonderful if any woman could find well-paid work where
and it'd be wonderful if there was a
respected.
federal job guarantee too. That would be great if MMT was acknowledged by politicians and we had what and people sort of got the sort of opportunities that everybody deserves. So a federal job guarantee would certainly help that. Yeah. Anyway, so
but I want to make clear that it's not just about not having jobs.
Sure.
It's about having, in terms of your choices, if your choice is between a very exploitative, low-paid job as a waitress or working in a bar or something where you may be subject to sexual comments and abuse of various sorts, and you don't make any money, and it's casual and what have you, and doing sex work where maybe you can choose your own hours, and you can work hours, for instance, in the evening when your children are not at school.
But that's where a federal job guarantee is good, because it just doesn't mean everybody you get a shit job, or you just take what you. It's actually sort of, you can, if you're not happy with the job in a particular state, if you hate the water that's in that state, like Flint, Michigan, you can actually move to another thing. So it actually opens up. It gives a lot more freedom in a lot of ways. That's why a federal job guarantee is
I think what
important.
I'm trying to say is that for sex workers, or for men, for some people, I mean, sex work is not a job that you take because there's nothing else available. I mean, it's actually seen for some people as a good job. I mean, there is a role for sex work in society. Yes, and let's talk about that, because that's a very important thing. This is something actually that a lot of people don't realize, that there are a lot of people who actually people with disabilities. There are people that just cannot, they cannot find partners, there's a whole lot of things. Well,
anyway, I'll let you talk. Let's talk about that.
Talk about it on a much more basic level. I mean, yes, of course, there are people with disabilities and that sort of stuff who may not be able to find a partner easily. And those people have a right to have some sort of sexual life. One has to have
of course, this excludes a whole lot of people, because a lot of people cannot afford to see sex workers, but we're just talking about there's a lot of people that cannot afford to.
I mean, working within SWAP, we also had lists of people who would work with people with disabilities, and we would be contacted by disability organizations. To
That's
see
very good.
who had some training. We actually had training for people to work with people of with mental disabilities, or with intellectual disabilities, with things like paraplegic or quadriplegic sort of disabilities, where people may not be able to sense certain parts of the body, and this sort of thing. And there's actually a level of training for those sorts of things. But people have a right to some level of sexual satisfaction, and quite often there are provisions for people in those situations.
And really, it's a sort of it's not just a sexual thing, it's intimacy. It's like having intimacy with another human being.
It's intimacy.
I mean,
this is something that sex workers provide to people, is actually the emotional connection as well as any kind of sexual connection. I mean, if you see a sex worker for an hour, typically most men, most people are not going to be involved in a sex act that takes an hour. There's a whole lot more. There are people who go to sex workers simply to talk.
That's right.
There are a lot of aspects in sex work that people don't really consider. And going back to, you talked about people who have difficulty finding a partner. Well, it's not just desperate people.
No.
There are people who
I didn't mean they're desperate.
Yeah, there are people who are very nice people, but they have sexual needs, and they may not have a partner that they feel that they are committed to, that they want to make a commitment to, or are in a committed relationship to, and that they don't want to do casual sex, because casual sex often implies that you're going to have some sort of ongoing intimate relationship. I mean, the idea of people hooking up in a bar or a club, and the woman and the guy saying, "Oh, I really like you," and them having sex, and then the woman is waiting, by the phone for the call that doesn't come. This is sort of a stereotype and a trope, but I mean, there's some truth in that. And
There
in
certainly
a
is.
sense, what sex work offers is sex without those ongoing emotional demands. In a sense, sex without strings, emotional strings. And that doesn't mean that sex workers don't develop an emotional relationship with a client they may see more than once.
Yeah.
And many sex workers do see clients on a regular basis. But the one thing about those relationships is, although there may be relationships of emotion and intimacy, and that the worker may know that client very well on an intimate basis, that sex worker is never going to make demands for a relationship. They're never going to say, "Why don't you, marry me?" or "Why don't you, take me out to dinner more often?" or something like that.
Yeah.
There isn't going to be that. And so in some senses, it's a more ethical thing to do than to go and try and chat up girls at a bar for men.
Sure, and tell them that you love them so that they'll...
And tell them you love them so that they'll have
they'll
sex with
sex
you.
with you. Yeah, that's kind of very
and
sad.
hope by the third, if you do that 3 times, the third date, that's the magic. This is what the movies say.
Yeah.
The third date is the one for sex.
Yeah.
Well, no. If you're in a place where you don't have somebody you're going to make a commitment to, you can make an honest transaction. You can say, "Look, I'm not looking for a long-term commitment with you. I'm looking for sex. If you're happy with that, I can give you this much money."
So what would you say about people that say, "Oh, but sex workers see married people and stuff, and isn't that, wrong," and all that kind of thing?
Okay, well, what I would say about that is sex workers don't ask whether a person is married or not, first off. And secondly, it's not the sex worker's responsibility. If somebody is married and they've made a commitment to someone else to be monogamous, then it's that person that needs to get their ethics together. If you want to talk to somebody or blame somebody, blame that person. They're the person who's decided to go off with someone else.
Yeah.
And of course, not all relationships are monogamous.
Yeah.
I know of situations where, a woman doesn't want to have sex. Well, okay, if she doesn't want to have sex, does that mean the man should never have sex again? And as long as it's an honest situation, I would say, one option is for that person to see a sex worker. And if they're seeing a sex worker, then they're not seeing somebody in an affair where that person might expect that person to divorce the other. And
this is where honesty comes in.
That's where honesty comes in.
Because unfortunately, a lot of, say, for example, in the United States, it's fairly sex negative in general. It's a kind of
and that
sex
breeds
negative.
dishonesty.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. Yeah, and then so people can't talk about their sexual needs with one another, or even and this is where we'll talk about BDSM just very briefly. So if you're offended by a talk about kink, about bondage and discipline and sadomasochism, that's the BDSM, then maybe you should tune out now. But because there are a lot of people with fetishes and stuff in the world. I
was going to go back.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. Go on.
I wasn't really finished.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Please continue.
Okay. Basically, you have situations. I think what you're saying about honesty is exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's something that sex workers will often say, to clients, not too strongly. I mean, it's up to each person to decide how honest they're going to be with their partner. Honesty is obviously the best policy, but if if like it's up to the person really to deal with their own relationships.
Yeah.
But sex workers are generally pretty honest, and sex workers might say, look, like, be honest with the person if that's the situation. But sex workers will end up dealing with people who, I've known sex workers who have a number of older clients whose wives may not be interested in sex at all, or have cancer or something like that, or some sort of illness where they're really unable to have sex. Sometimes the partner will know that they're seeing somebody. There may be other situations where somebody has their sexual needs are just not being met, and they really don't want to lose the emotional relationship they have with their partner, and the connection with their family, their children, and that kind of stuff. They don't want to break up the family, and yet they feel they want to have their sexual needs met. And these are not awful people. These are people who, they're not weird or kinky or have strange desires. They're just ordinary people who,
And may I say, just for the record, for all the sex workers that I've met in my life, I'd have to say they're the most non-judgmental people and nicest people one could ever meet. I mean, these representations in the media, particularly on these TV shows and stuff, the police shows and stuff, where they're out of their mind on drugs and they're riddled with diseases and stuff like that. I mean, truly, it's just not.
Yeah.
It's just sad. It's just not true. It's not true. And in fact, you're more likely to pick up STIs, sexually transmitted infections from the public, from dealings with the public than you ever are from sex workers.
Well, that's something in Australia particularly, and in jurisdictions where it's decriminalised. One of the advantages of that is people can go into sexual health services and get screened regularly and that kind of stuff, and people do. And part of the occupational health thing is making sure that, before they have sex, they examine the genitals of their partner. They make sure they go and have a shower and that kind of stuff. They make sure they use condoms and lube and all that sort of stuff. And as a result, yes, in sexual health terms, sex workers in Australia have a lower incidence of STIs than the general public. Yeah. You're more likely to get an STI meeting somebody in a pub or a club or at work and than you will with a sex worker. Yeah. Now, that's not always the case in situations where it's criminalized. Like in WA a few years back, there was situations... Western Australia. There was a situation where, if a sex worker was caught with condoms, then that was seen as proof that they were sex workers and they would be arrested. Really? Yes. And so they had to... How long ago was that? Probably... Wow, I can imagine everybody 15 years, 20 years. Yeah. Wow. Probably 25 years. That's amazing. And so you'd have sex workers who would have to make sure they didn't have any condoms on them, which makes it really difficult with the whole safe sex thing. Yeah. Did they tuck them into their socks? Well, they would usually find some place to hide them. Right. God. But I mean, that's really sad. How absurd to have that as a result of a law against sex work. God, who was in office then? Anyway, so... Richard Court. That was terrible. That's terrible. Okay, so now, we'll talk just really briefly about BDSM. That's kink. So if anybody's offended by that sort of thing... BDSM is bondage, discipline, sadomasochism, or bondage, discipline, domination, submission, and sadomasochism.
And it's not 50 Shades of Grey.
It's not 50 Shades of Grey.
Okay, so let's talk about the, why BDSM is actually it can be very helpful for, there's a lot of sex workers that then become, sort of professional dominatrix.
Well, there's not a lot of sex workers that become...
No, I'm saying that some. I said some.
Yeah, there are some.
Some that become. I don't mean everybody becomes. It's not a graduation ceremony.
No, very few.
Very few. But if you can just talk,
it is a specialized area.
Yeah, talk about that, Didi, and let's sort of mystify. Oh well, just this sort of.
That's probably a very, very big subject.
No, I'm talking about the fetishes that people have and how they can't talk about that with their partners, and so they end up, and some people can only. Anyway, that's all I was really talking about.
Basically, BDSM is sort of the
content
bogey,
warning.
The bogey of sex generally.
Yes.
If people are sex negative, marginally sex negative, they usually freak out about BDSM.
Yes.
And BDSM is pretty much anything outside the box of you get together with somebody, you have a nice sensual time, you both have intercourse and have orgasms.
Now we're talking very heteronormative. We're talking very heteronormatively here, but
I said have intercourse, and that's not heteronormative.
Okay, go on.
But BDSM, there are a lot of different areas, and this is where I think you've opened a big.
Okay,
area.
we don't have to talk about it if you.
Okay.
Or do you want to talk about just a small part of it?
We might want to do that as a whole separate live stream.
I don't know. That might be a bit tricky. I don't know. I'll have to ask.
Just very briefly, yes, that is a small area of sex work.
I'm just talking about the fetishes. We don't have to talk about, the fetishes that people have, and they cannot talk about it with their partner, and things like, wanting to lay on newspapers, and they get sexually excited by that, and things like that.
Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about.
There are things. Fetishes are about having some particular thing that rings your sexual bell. Sometimes it is something that you need in order to find sexual arousal or gratification. And they can be all kinds of things. I mean, there's a lot of fetish which is kind of fashion. There's this whole scene, the leather scene, the rubber scene, which is very much about fashion. And some people legitimately have rubber fetishes or leather fetishes, but mostly it's about image and that kind of stuff.
We're vegan, so we don't leather.
Yeah, we don't do leather.
No.
But I mean, there are alternate, pleather sort of things.
We're not talking about ourselves anyway. We're just saying we don't wear leather shoes or coats or whatever. We're vegan. Okay, go on.
But fetishes can be things like, like I know of fetishes like somebody who was incredibly aroused by the smell of fresh bread. And so for a really good sexual time, they would go out and buy several loaves of bread and put it around the bedroom.
That's interesting.
With their partner. There are people who, as Tricia indicated, might have something with newspaper where, they, what rings their bell is to be
covered in newspaper.
To kneel on newspaper, be covered in newspaper, and smacked with a rolled up newspaper on the bum. And that's enough for them.
Yes. Anyway, so the point of
very unusual.
The point of this conversation is that there are people that have very they have different things that arouse them that they could never find anybody who would actually be interested.
It's unlikely. If they find somebody to marry and get and have children with and all that stuff, have a good emotional relationship. They might have a very good emotional relationship. And yet there's this little secret part
Yes.
of their life, and they feel like they can't speak to their partner
Yes.
about this.
Yeah.
And probably a more common thing, I mean, that newspaper thing is actually very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
A more common sort of fetish might be cross-dressing.
Yeah.
Yeah, where people really want,
Men.
silky
Mostly
underwear.
men.
Mostly men.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mostly men.
Women
We're pretty much
cross-dress anyway.
Yes.
It's not cross-dressing.
Women cross-dress all
wear
the
anything.
time.
Yeah. But men might have a sexual thing. And there's different types of cross-dressing. There's cross-dressing which is gender identity related, but there's also the paraphilia of cross-dressing, which is where it's very definitely sexually related, and people, kind of get off on the silkiness and the, and this sort of thing. And they feel ashamed to say that to their partner.
Isn't that sad?
They don't want to be seen as gay. They might be heterosexual men, frequently are. Actually, the most common thing is that they're heterosexual men. They often feel quite a lot of shame around this sort of thing.
And isn't that sad?
And it's very sad.
It's very, very sad.
And they might go see
This is what patriarchy does.
a sex worker and be able to dress in these things. And quite often it won't be sexual at all. There won't be any intercourse involved in this.
Yeah.
But it's an opportunity for them to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, is this awful or evil? Well, it's just human. Some people are like that.
Yeah.
And, instead of condemning those people, sex workers say, well, all right, we'll help you. We'll facilitate this.
Yeah.
That's all right. Yeah, it's very harmless.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. I just wanted to say this.
I've known sex workers who, with somebody coming, a few times, they've said, the person has admitted that they feel kind of very ashamed and stuff like that. And the sex worker talked about them and said, look, tell your partner. You don't know. There's a lot, that particular sex worker knew a number of people who cross-dressed and their partners knew about it. And I said, talk to your partner about it.
Yeah.
And the person did, in fact, do that and worked out something with their partner and came back and thanked the sex worker.
Oh.
I mean, sex workers also provide often a level of education and, in a sense, sexual therapy that a lot of people don't get. It may be somebody who is incredibly shy or feels inadequate sexually, and sometimes sex workers will often know things from therapy, things like sensate focus exercises where you don't have sex, you relieve the pressure to have sex, that you kind of take the guilt away and just sort of be sensual with that person. And this is actually something straight sex therapists do.
Yeah.
Sex surrogates. And and then maybe after a few sessions lead into that. But I mean, there's those therapeutic aspects in sex work too. Now that's not all sex work by any means either.
Yeah.
A lot of sex work is just sex.
Yes.
But,
yes.
But there's so many reasons.
Yeah,
for sex.
There's counseling. There's all sorts of things in sex work.
A lot of people see sex, clients who, for one reason or another, don't have a partner for whom they can find any kind of sexual satisfaction.
Yeah. So, Didi, there's what?
And this is a valid role. I mean, I think this would be valid regardless of, even if there's fabulous jobs for women, that there are probably women who would engage in this kind of work and see it as a socially valuable thing.
Yeah. So what could progressive people do to help sex workers?
I think educate yourself about sex work. I think talk to sex workers if you can find any, and be open.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about people who've left the sex industry and are attacking it and generally are making a bunch of money and getting funded by anti-sex work organizations, which are often religious organizations and this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah.
Educate yourself and get your information from sex workers, from people.
Or sex worker organizations.
Well, that's the place to get it.
Yes.
Sex worker organizations are the place to get information, from sex workers and from the sex worker perspective.
So really,
it's why, for instance, Amnesty International has endorsed the decriminalization of sex work.
That's right.
And rejected the Swedish model. They did that only after years of research.
Yes.
And talking to so many people.
Did you say they endorsed the Swedish model, or they
No,
didn't? No,
they
they
rejected
didn't.
the
They
Swedish
rejected
model.
it. Yes, I was going to say.
Endorsed decriminalization.
The Swedish model, just in case you've only just joined in, is when they sort of criminalize the clients.
The clients instead of.
And then, of course,
worker.
that affects the sex worker because clients
And it just drives everything back underground.
drives everything back underground. And that's what we don't want. We don't want things to be driven underground because that's where women get exploited terribly and hurt.
That's where you get corruption.
You get corruption,
That's where
you get violence.
Get the vulnerability. That's where you get
violence.
The violence.
You get sex workers going missing because serial killers and stuff. It's
all of that.
All sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So decriminalization is really, really important. And I see that as like a feminist issue. Yeah. Really, I don't know what these sex work and these sex worker exclusive feminists are.
Just
anyway.
One final thing.
Yes,
they talk about the sex work is damaging to, it's anti-feminist and this sort of stuff. Well, if there's any industry that works against feminism, it's advertising. There's so much misogyny in advertising. And those people make a lot of money.
Yes.
And
there's so much misogyny on social media, isn't there?
Well, misogyny is everywhere.
Yes, misogyny is
everywhere. But I'm talking
everywhere.
about where women are working, and that has a negative impact on women. The advertising, the ads where women are, being laid across a table, and all the Hugo Boss ads, and all of that kind of
stuff. The whole thing,
There's an awful lot of horrifically sexist, ads, patriarchal, sexist, misogynist ads. And they happen
totally
all the
acceptable
time.
too. There's so much acceptable misogyny today. It's no wonder there's so much violence against women, so much rape, so much domestic violence and all that sort of thing, because misogyny is so acceptable. But then racism seems to be quite acceptable. There's a lot of isms that seem to be just skyrocketing now. I don't know what on earth's going on. Things seem to be going backward to me. But anyway, so really that was all. Is there anything else that we need to say about sex work? And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section, and Dee Dee can sort of, answer them there. But you can ask them right now if anybody has any. Don't be shy.
And see this later.
Yep.
I'll endeavor to come back and answer things.
Yeah, we could, if you leave some questions, we could come back another time. But we thought that, talking about sex work and not doing it in a sensational way or naughty women or in a sex negative way.
Poor women who are drug addicts and dragged in by pimps and
this
all
is the sad thing, like there was
this
a very
narrative that you see.
There are some journalists who, instead of interviewing sex worker organizations, they interview sex, worker exclusive feminists who, sort of go along the Andrea Dawkins model. And Andrea Dawkins was sort of like a feminist who was starting to side with the right-wing Christians. And, sort of that women need to be sort of like, protected from the evil. It's like this. It's just more patriarchy, really. I mean, women in the end, have a right to do with their body, pro-choice. They should be able to do also what they wish, with their own bodies. And it's not up to patriarchy and up to men to be and sex worker exclusive feminists to be telling women what they can and cannot do. And, it's unfortunate we live in such a misogynist and sexist society. But I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why women do sex work.
Well,
anyway,
to draw a line under it, I mean,
of course, I'm talking about women now.
The main reason
that men and
sex
trans
workers, and that includes men and trans people and all of that. The main reason sex workers do sex work is money. Because it offers them a chance to make money. The second main reason is because they have more control of their time, the time that they're working, and they can fit it into their life more easily. And those two things together are often a quite powerful reason to choose to do sex work rather than the other options available.
Yeah.
If there were many more options that were good, there may be fewer people who make those choices.
Yes.
That doesn't make the choice inherently bad.
Yeah.
But,
and a lot of
but that criminalization of sex work really opens the door for corruption, for forcing those women into a vulnerable situation in which they live lives where they're heavily stigmatized. They are forced to cut off often from friends and family out of some sense of shame, where they can't have access to the police or the justice system, where the police are often exploitative and corrupt, where they become victims of violence, of rape, of theft, and that sort of thing. And this is the result of criminalization. And the way to address a lot of these things is to decriminalize, to allow women to work that way, to be able to access the police, to be open about what they're doing. And this won't increase the number of people who are doing sex work. This it will decrease the number of people who are doing standover things, the amount of violence, the amount of rape, the amount of people who are taken off and killed, which is a frequent danger.
You're talking about sex workers now.
For sex workers.
Yeah.
It is particularly important for people in lower income or people who are subject to discrimination, and that includes trans people and people of color.
Yes.
But poor people of any sort. It includes migrants, and that includes Russian migrants or European migrants and that sort of thing.
And may I say that people really need to get their head around the whole trans issue thing and stop being so ridiculous about transphobic. Seriously.
Yeah.
And I invite you to watch Abby Martin's The Empire Files. She did a recent episode about trans rights, and I'll leave a link to that. And also because it's a very good episode, and I think she got some crap for that, which is sort of like truly amazing. people really need to snap out of it. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, and the other thing is the Real News Network, as I mentioned in the beginning, has did an interview with a member of the Sex Workers Outreach Project in the United States, and that's a very good interview, and I'll leave a link to that. So I hope that you found this of some benefit.
I have one last thing to say.
Yes, please.
In terms of the United States particularly, where you have groups of people who are very vulnerable and poverty is endemic.
Yeah.
And that often leads to drug use and that sort of stuff. Criminalizing isn't going to help anybody.
No.
In those situations, criminalizing sex work. Decriminalization may not address all of the reasons people might go into sex work, which is exploitative. That will only be addressed by addressing the fundamental things of the poverty, the discrimination, and that kind of thing, and making sure people have more options. But yes, criminalization is not going to do a thing.
No.
All that's going to mean is those people who are doing sex work will have access to the police and to the justice system.
Yeah, and they deserve it.
And the health system and things like that.
Yeah.
And they deserve it.
Yes.
As a human right.
Yes, as a human right. So, as feminists, we should be supporting women in those situations so that they are not exposed to unnecessary violence and and awfulness, really. So, it's an important thing. Anyway, so...
No sex worker wants to see sex work done in an exploitative way.
No. It's, they certainly don't. Anyway, so I don't think there's really much else that we need to... hopefully this has made sense, and I hope I haven't said anything too naff, too ignorant. It's tricky. It's a sort of a big subject, but it's also in some ways very simple, like what is required, to keep women safe and to and that's an important thing.
Keep people safe.
Exactly. It's also not just women.
We should have to remember that there are male sex workers.
That's right, male sex workers,
and
exactly.
Trans sex workers.
Yes, exactly. We tend to talk about women more because there probably is a lot more women than
the majority of sex workers.
But we need to think about trans people. And you're welcome, Dale. Thanks for joining in. I hope you get to see that, see it from the beginning, if you just joined in. And thank you very much for watching. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about some tricky issues that we should sort of try and address the ones that are sort of have the least amount of sort of exposure and oftentimes really, really bad exposure. It's really, really bad. So we thought we better talk about this one, and we might revisit it again because the more people that think about this in a sort of not in a sensationalist way and not in a, sort of like we have to do something to protect women sort of thing, I'm talking about now in a sort of a patriarchal sense, that sort of thing. Women and property kind of business. But anyway, so, it's important that we try and talk about this fairly regularly anyway. And so share this with others if you find it beneficial. And anyway, my name's Trish Roberts and this is Dee Dee River.
Thanks,
and you're watching
everybody.
Faint Signals from Vega and on Real Progressives. So till next time, think about going vegan as well if you aren't vegan. It would be one of the best decisions you make in your life, and there's so many benefits, but the most important one is that non-human animals are not our resources.
And veganism is sexy.
No, don't say that. That's terrible. She didn't mean that. She was joking. It's a terrible thing. We don't go along the lines of Peter and stuff. You're very naughty for saying that. Okay, so think about going vegan, and until next time, my name's Trish Roberts. This is Dee Dee River. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.